The drought had turned the grass to straw and the sky to brass, and Della Whitfield knelt at the edge of a dry creek bed, scraping her fingers through the cracked mud in search of anything that might still be growing there. She found a few stunted wild onions, their green tops brittle, and pulled them free, brushing the dirt against her skirt before tucking them into the pocket of her apron. It was late April, the kind of April that should have smelled of new grass and thaw, but instead smelled of dust. She had walked most of 2 days from Hartwell Junction, a town that no longer had any use for her, carrying a carpet bag with 2 dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a small tin of coins that would not last the week. She was 24 years old. She had blue eyes, the color of a Montana sky before a storm, and dark hair that had come loose from its pins somewhere around noon the day before. She had been, until 3 weeks ago, the schoolteacher in Hartwell Junction, a position she had held since she was 19, a position she had loved with the whole of her heart. But the school board had a new president, a man named Otis Farrow, and Otis Farrow had a niece who needed a position, and there was no contract, no promise, nothing written down that could stand against a man who controlled the purse strings of the county. She had been let go with 2 weeks' pay and a letter of recommendation she doubted anyone would read. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now, kneeling in the dry creek bed with wild onions in her pocket. She simply stood, brushed off her knees, and kept walking, because walking was the only thing left to do. The sound of the wagon reached her before she saw it, a heavy creak of wood and iron, and the slow clop of a mule that had seen better pastures. She stepped to the side of the road to let it pass, keeping her eyes down out of habit, the habit of a woman who had learned that a stranger's attention was rarely a kindness. But the wagon slowed. Then it stopped. She looked up. The man on the seat was younger than she expected, though not young, perhaps 30, with sun-browned skin and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of strong coffee. He wore a plain canvas coat, patched at one elbow, and a hat that had clearly been rained on and dried more times than anyone could count. He did not smile at her, and he did not frown either. He simply looked, the way a man looks at weather he is trying to read. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," he said. It was not a question, and there was no accusation in it either. Just a fact laid on the table between them like a hand of cards. "I'm aware," Della said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at the carpet bag in her hand, then back at her face, at the dust on her hem, and the sunburn beginning to color the bridge of her nose. He seemed to be doing arithmetic behind those coffee-colored eyes, weighing something. "You know anything about children?" he asked. Of all the questions she had braced herself for on this road, an insult, a warning to keep moving. Worse, this was not one she had imagined. "I was a schoolteacher," she said. 7 years. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "My name is Caleb Sorensen. I've got a ranch 2 hours west of here, and I've got 3 children who haven't had a lesson since their mother passed last spring, and a housekeeper who quit on account of the youngest one, putting a garter snake in her mixing bowl." He said this without a trace of humor, though Della thought she saw something flicker at the corner of his mouth. "I can't pay much. Room, board, and $8 a month. But it's honest work, and it's a roof." Della stood very still. She thought of the empty schoolhouse in Hartwell Junction, of Otis Farrow's niece sitting at her old desk. She thought of the tin of coins in her bag and how many days it might buy her in a town where no one knew her name. She thought, too, of the wild onions in her pocket, and how strange it was that hunger could make a person humble in ways that pride never could. "I can teach children," she said, "and I don't scare easy, not even from snakes." Something in his face eased, just slightly, like a fence post settling into ground that had finally softened. "Climb up then," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at that hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then took it and let him pull her up onto the wagon seat beside him. Neither of them spoke again until the ranch came into view. Low buildings, the color of weathered bone against the vast gold plain, and behind them, faint and blue, the shape of mountains that had not yet let go of their winter snow. The children were waiting on the porch before the wagon had even stopped, as children do when they sense something is about to change. There were 3 of them, a boy of about 11, solemn and watchful, who introduced himself as Thomas and did not offer a smile. A girl of 8 named Ruth, all elbows and freckles, who studied Della with open, unembarrassed curiosity. And the youngest, a boy of 5 named Jonah, who was missing a front tooth and who announced, without any preamble at all, that he had once caught a snake bigger than his arm and he would catch another one if the new lady made him do arithmetic. "I'll consider myself warned," Della told him, and something in Ruth's face cracked open into the beginning of a grin. The house told its own story before anyone spoke a word of it. It was clean in the way a house is clean, when someone is trying very hard and does not quite know how the furniture dusted but arranged wrong. A stack of mended clothes piled on a chair because no one had decided where they belonged. A child's drawing pinned crookedly to the wall beside a photograph of a woman with Ruth's same freckles, draped in black ribbon. Della understood, without being told, that the house was grieving as surely as the children were. She did not ask questions that first evening. She simply set down her bag, found the kitchen, and began. There was flour, and there was salt pork, and there was a jar of dried apples that had clearly been forgotten at the back of a shelf. She made biscuits, and she stewed the apples with what little sugar she found, and by the time Caleb came in from the barn, smelling of horse and hard work, there was a meal on the table, and 3 children already seated, waiting with an eagerness that made something tighten in Della's chest. Caleb stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table, at his children's faces, at Della standing by the stove with flour on her sleeve, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Then he sat down, and he ate, and when he was finished he said only, "It's been a long while since this table looked like this." "It won't always look like this," Della said honestly. "Some nights it'll be beans and nothing else. I'm a teacher, not a miracle. Beans and nothing else, with the children fed and the house feeling like a house again, would still be more than we've had," he said. And that was the whole of his gratitude, plain and unadorned. But Della understood it was no small thing, coming from a man who did not seem to spend words carelessly. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Della had not realized she'd been hungry for. Mornings were lessons at the kitchen table, slates and a battered primer she found in a trunk, Thomas working through his sums with the stubborn seriousness of a boy who had decided that being solemn was a way of holding himself together, Ruth reciting her letters with theatrical enthusiasm, Jonah mostly determined to escape into the yard the moment Della's attention wavered. Afternoons were chores and the endless small business of a working ranch, mending, gardening, the slow coaxing of a kitchen garden out of soil that had gone to weeds. Evenings were suppers around that same long table, and slowly, meal by meal, lesson by lesson, the house began to breathe differently. Caleb was not a man who spoke of feelings, but Della watched him notice things. She watched him observe the way Thomas had begun, almost against his will, to laugh at Jonah's antics again. She watched him notice that Ruth had started humming while she did her chores, an old hymn their mother used to sing, one the girl had not sung in the year since she died. He said nothing about any of it directly, but Della caught him once, standing in the barn doorway at dusk, watching the lit windows of his own house with an expression she could not quite name, something between disbelief and a hunger far older than any hunger for food. He began doing small things, the way a man does who does not know how to say what he means and so says it instead with his hands. He fixed the sagging shelf in the pantry that Della had complained about only once, in passing. He oiled the hinge on the kitchen door that had squealed every time it opened, so that now it swung silent, and Della found herself almost missing the sound of it, a small alarm bell that had once told her when someone was near. He rode 2 extra hours into the county seat one Saturday, and came back with a proper set of school books, worn but whole, and set them on the table without a word of explanation, as if they had simply appeared there of their own accord. Della noticed. She said nothing about it either, but that evening she made a dried apple pie with a lattice crust she had not attempted in years, and when Caleb took his first bite, he went very still, the way a man does when a taste carries him somewhere he had not meant to go. Their conversations remained brief, practical, bounded by children and chores and weather. But beneath the practical words, something else had begun to grow, quiet and unhurried as spring itself, and neither of them named it, because naming it felt like it might frighten it away. It was Thomas who brought the first real trouble into the house, though he did not mean to. He came running from the mailbox one afternoon in early June, with an envelope clutched in his fist, his solemn face gone pale. "There's a letter from the land office," he said, holding it out to his father with the particular dread of a child who has learned, too young, to recognize the shape of bad news. Caleb read it, standing on the porch, and Della watched his shoulders go rigid, the way a fence post goes rigid when the weight against it becomes too much to bear quietly. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he folded the letter and said, in a voice stripped of all its usual steadiness, "There's a dispute on the water rights to the north section. Cyrus Bellamy is claiming the creek was diverted onto Sorensen land unlawfully 30 years back, when my father first settled here, and he's filed to have the boundary redrawn." Della had heard the name Bellamy before, from the children. From a ranch hand's muttered complaint over supper, the biggest landholder in 3 counties, a man who had bought out 2 smaller ranches already that spring and was said to want a third. "Can he do that?" Della asked. "After 30 years? He's got a lawyer in Cheyenne and money enough to make an old survey say whatever he wants it to say," Caleb said. "If the water rights go to him, this ranch doesn't have enough grass or enough water to hold the herd through summer. We'd be finished inside a year." That night, after the children were asleep, Della found Caleb at the kitchen table, with the old ranch ledgers spread before him, and beside them, an even older tin box she had not seen before, filled with yellowed papers. "Those are my father's records," Caleb said, without looking up, "from when he first settled this land. If there's any proof the creek was always ours, it would be here, if it's anywhere." Della sat down across from him without asking. She had spent 7 years teaching children to read handwriting far worse than any ranch ledger. 7 years untangling sums that did not add up, until she found the one small error that made everything else make sense. "Let me help," she said. It was not a question either. They worked past midnight, the lamp burning low, the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound beside the rustle of old paper. It was Della who found it, near 1 in the morning, her eyes burning with fatigue, a surveyor's notation from 31 years back, faded nearly to nothing, marking the creek's original course before a dry summer had shifted its bed half a mile south, exactly where it ran today. A note, easy to miss, that proved the water had always belonged to Sorensen land, drought or no drought, long before Cyrus Bellamy's lawyers had ever drawn their new lines on a map. Caleb stared at the page as if he could not quite trust his own eyes. "You found in one evening what I've been afraid to look for in 3 weeks, he said quietly. "You weren't afraid to look," Della said. "You were afraid of what you'd find if you didn't." He looked up at her then, really looked, in the lamplight, and something passed between them that neither one of them tried to put into words. "I don't know how to thank you for this," he said. "You already have," Della said. "Every day, in ways you don't think to notice." And she meant the school books, and the oiled door hinge, and the shelf that no longer sagged, and 100 other small, unspoken kindnesses that had told her, long before either of them said so, exactly what kind of man Caleb Sorensen was. The hearing was set for the county courthouse in Larkspur 2 weeks later, and the whole ranch seemed to hold its breath in the days leading up to it. Cyrus Bellamy arrived with his lawyer in a buggy so polished it looked out of place against the dust of Larkspur's main street, and he wore the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no and meant to keep it that way. The boundary was always meant to run along the original creek bed, Bellamy's lawyer argued before the county judge, laying out a survey map dense with lines and figures. "Whatever the water does now is not what the law recognizes." Caleb rose to answer, and Della watched his jaw tighten, watched him reach for words that did not come easily to a man who trusted the tangible world of fences and cattle far more than courtrooms and legal argument. But when he spoke, He laid the old surveyor's page on the judge's desk himself, and his voice, though rough, did not waver. My father filed this record 31 years ago, the year the creek shifted in a dry summer, same as this one, Caleb said. The water has run the same course every year since, through no trick of ours, only through what nature did on its own. This isn't a matter of what a man wants a boundary to be. It's a matter of what's true, and what's been true for 3 decades, whether it's convenient for Mr. Bellamy or not. The judge studied the surveyor's faded notation for a long while, comparing it against the newer map, and the courtroom was silent except for the creak of the old floorboards and the soft ticking of a wall clock. When he finally spoke, his ruling was plain and unhurried. The original record stood. The water rights remained with Sorensen land, as they always had. Cyrus Bellamy left Larkspur without a word to anyone, his polished buggy raising dust down the road toward whatever ranch he meant to trouble next. Caleb stood on the courthouse steps for a long moment afterward, the old paper still in his hand, and when Della came to stand beside him, he looked at her the way a man looks at ground he had thought was lost, and finds, against all expectation, solid beneath his feet again. "You saved this place," he said, "not just tonight. Since the day I found you on that road with the dust on your hem and nothing left in your bag but a Bible and 2 dresses. "I only found an old piece of paper," Della said. "You found a great deal more than that," Caleb said, "and I've been too slow and too much a coward about matters of the heart to say so properly." They rode home together in near silence, the mountains turning violet in the last of the evening light, and it was not until the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet that Caleb found her on the porch, looking out at the ranch that would, after all, still be theirs come winter. "I'm not a man with a great many words, Della," he said, standing beside her in the dark. "I see fences and I see cattle and I see the work in front of me, and half the time I miss the things that matter most until they're near enough to slip away. But I haven't missed this. I've known for some weeks now what I feel, and I've been too careful, too slow, to say it plain." She turned to look at him, her eyes steady in the dim porch light. She waited, the way she had learned to wait for a man who chose his words with such care. "The children love you," he went on. Thomas laughs again. "Ruth sings her mother's hymns without being asked. Jonah still catches snakes, but he tells you about it first, which I take as a kind of trust. And he stopped, gathering himself the way a man gathers his courage before a jump he cannot take back. "I find I cannot picture this house without you in it, not as a hired teacher. As my wife, if you'll have a man as slow and plain-spoken as I am." For a moment Della said nothing at all, only looked at him, at the man who had pulled her up onto a wagon seat on a dusty road and asked if she knew anything about children, who had oiled a door hinge and fixed a shelf, and ridden 2 hours for school books instead of saying outright what he felt. A small, warm smile touched her lips. "I was wondering when you'd get around to it, Caleb Sorensen," she said. "You're a good man. But you are a slow one." He let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the whole hard spring behind it, and the grin that broke across his face was the first Della had seen from him that held nothing back at all. "I expect I am," he said. "I expect I'm slow in most everything, except knowing a good thing when it's sitting across the supper table from me every night." They were married the following month, on a Saturday, in the small church at Larkspur, with Thomas and Ruth and Jonah standing at the front in their Sunday clothes, Ruth crying happy tears she pretended were nothing of the sort, and Jonah solemnly informing the minister that he had caught a snake that very morning in honor of the occasion, which he had, mercifully, left outside. Della wore a blue dress she had sewn herself from cloth, Caleb had bought without telling her why, and when the ceremony was done, the whole ranch crew came back to the house for a supper Della had, of course, cooked herself, platters of roast and biscuits and a dried apple pie for every table. Because some things, she had decided, were worth doing herself, even on her own wedding day. 5 years on, the ranch had grown fat and green with good water and better luck, the herd larger than it had been in a generation, the fences mended, and the house always full of noise. Thomas was 16 now, tall and steady, Running cattle alongside his father with an ease that made Caleb's chest ache with pride, he rarely spoke aloud. Ruth was 13, still humming her mother's hymns, though she had added a few of her own invention that made no sense at all and delighted her regardless. Jonah was 10 and had, against all reasonable expectation, given up snakes in favor of horses, though he still kept one small garter snake as a pet in a jar on his windowsill, a fact Della had long since stopped fighting. And there was another child now, too, a girl of 3 with her mother's dark hair and her father's slow, careful way of considering the world before she spoke a word of it, toddling across the porch on unsteady legs, while Caleb watched her with the same quiet wonder he had once turned on a schoolhouse ledger full of numbers that, against all odds, had finally added up to a life he had not known he was allowed to want. In the evenings, Della and Caleb still sat together on that same porch, the mountains turning gold and then violet in the last of the light, and sometimes he would reach for her hand the way he had that first night after the ruling in Larkspur, and she would let her fingers curl around his, a fit that had only grown more certain with the passing of the years. "Do you ever think about that dry creek bed?" Caleb asked her once. "The one where I found you?" "Every spring," Della said. "It reminds me that even what looks like nothing at all can still be the start of everything." He tightened his arm around her, and they sat together in the comfortable quiet of a life built not on any single grand moment, but on the steady accumulation of small, decent things: a mended shelf, an oiled hinge, a schoolbook bought without asking, an old page of paper found at midnight that had saved more than land, a hand reached for and found in the dark and never once let go. Sometimes the thing that saves us isn't a grand rescue, but a small kindness offered plainly, a ride on a dusty road, a shelf quietly mended, a hand that keeps showing up. Della and Caleb remind us that love rarely announces itself. It builds meal by meal, chore by chore, patience by patience. So notice the quiet people fixing things around you without being asked. That's often where the real love lives. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for your entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson still found a place in your heart.